Somewhere in an archive, there is a page. It's a census. Colonial paperwork. The kind of document nobody reads for pleasure. The kind that exists only so a government somewhere can know what it owns. Columns. Categories. A number in careful ink beside each one. And beside the category for the island's original people, the ones who were standing on that shore when the ships came, the ones whose name is still on half the map, somebody wrote a number. The number was 0. That's how it happens. Not with a last battle, not with a final stand and a witness to remember it. A man at a desk, at the end of a long afternoon, decides a category no longer applies. And a people stop existing. Officially. Permanently. In ink. 15 years before that page, the same administration had counted about 2,300 of them. Still there. Still being written down. And then, nothing. Not a decline. Not a dwindling. Nothing. For the next 2 centuries, that nothing was the truth. It went into the histories, into the encyclopedias, into the schoolrooms of the island itself, where children were taught that the Taíno were finished, a tragedy that had already completed itself long before anyone alive could have done anything about it. Then, at the end of the 1990s, a geneticist on that island did something nobody had thought to do. He didn't go to the archive. He didn't go to a dig site. He went to the living. And what he found in ordinary Puerto Rican blood should not have been possible. I want to be careful here because this story has been told badly for a long time in both directions. First as a total extinction, then as a fairy tale. The truth is stranger and better than either. So let me start where the erasure started, because you can't feel the ending unless you understand exactly how thorough the deleting was. Before the ships, the island had a name, Puerto Rican. The people there built stone-lined ceremonial courts in the mountains, and some of those courts are still standing. If you drive the winding road up to Utuado today, past the sharp curves, into that green stillness where the air cools and the noise of the coast falls away, you can walk on them. Flat rectangles bordered by upright stones, laid out beneath a mountain they believed the gods lived inside. Some of those boundary stones weigh more than a ton. They were hauled up from the river below by hand, by people who wanted this particular ground marked in this particular place, permanently. They weren't just playing a ball game on those courts. They were settling disputes there, forming alliances, choosing ritual competition over bloodshed, which is a more sophisticated idea than most empires ever managed. And on a small, uninhabited island off the west coast, they did something I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I read it. They went into the caves, not the entrances, not the lit chambers near the mouth where you'd expect to find shelter. They went deep, into what archaeologists call the dark zone, chambers where no daylight has ever reached, hundreds of meters in, carrying torches through labyrinths of soft limestone. And in the dark, they made marks. Thousands of them. Faces, animals, long meandering lines. Some painted, some drawn in charcoal, and many of them made by simply pressing fingers into the soft rock and dragging, pulling the darker surface away to reveal the pale layer underneath, so the design glows against the wall. Fingers, in the dark. Deep enough inside the earth that you would have to want to be there. Around 70 cave systems on that one small island have been surveyed so far, and they hold the greatest concentration of indigenous art anywhere in the Caribbean. Most of it was made in the 2 centuries right before the ships arrived. That's who was declared extinct, not a scattered handful of people. A civilization with a cosmology, an architecture, a diplomatic system, and an art tradition practiced in total darkness for reasons we still only partly understand. And here is the part that turns my stomach a little. The erasure didn't require killing all of them. It never does. It required categories. Disease and forced labor did catastrophic damage in the first 50 years. That part of the story is real, and it is not softened by anything that comes later. But the finishing work was administrative. Priests recording births chose which box to tick. A person who was Indian in one record became mixed in the next, and colored in the one after that, and their grandchildren appeared in the ledgers as something else entirely. Nobody died in that process. A category did. The people who live with the consequences have a name for this. They call it paper genocide. And once you hear the phrase, you start seeing it everywhere in the historical record, because it turns out to be one of the most reliable tools of empire there is. You don't have to remove a people from the land if you can remove them from the paperwork. The land follows. Then the United States took over the census, and for most of the 20th century, there wasn't even an option. If you came from Latin America, you were white or black or mixed. There was no box for what your grandmother had told you. So the thing about the Taíno being extinct became a fact the way most facts become facts. Everyone repeated it, nobody checked it, and the people best positioned to object had been given no language in which to object. That's where it stood until one man decided to check. His name is Juan Martinez-Cruzado, and he was a biology professor at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez. What he designed was not a study of people who claimed native ancestry. That would have proven nothing. He designed a study of Puerto Ricans, randomly selected, systematically sampled to represent the island's whole population using the housing census as his frame. 800 of them. Ordinary people. People with no theory about themselves. People who, if you had asked them, would mostly have told you they were Spanish with some African, and a little bit of Indian somewhere way back, the way everybody says. He looked at their mitochondrial DNA. Now, here's the only piece of science in this entire video you need to hold on to, and it fits in one breath. Mitochondrial DNA comes only from your mother. It doesn't mix. It doesn't blend. It passes down the female line like a name that can't be changed, mother to daughter, essentially unaltered. Which means if you carry a native maternal line, there is no partial version of that. It isn't a trace. It isn't a percentage. It is an unbroken chain of indigenous mothers, every single link intact, running backward from you to before the ships. 61%. More than 6 in 10 randomly chosen Puerto Ricans carried it. Not a remnant. Not a rare survival in an isolated mountain village. The majority of the island. I've read that number a dozen times now, and it still does something to me, because think about what it actually describes. Every one of those people had been taught the extinction. Many of them had repeated it. Some of them had probably corrected a relative who claimed otherwise. And the whole time, the evidence was sitting inside their own cells, being carried faithfully by their mothers and their mothers' mothers, for 400 years, waiting for somebody to think of looking. The official story hadn't been slightly wrong. It had been wrong about the majority of the population. But mitochondrial DNA has one limitation, and the critics went straight for it. A maternal line tells you that one woman in each generation was indigenous. It doesn't tell you how much of a person's total ancestry is indigenous, and honestly, for most Puerto Ricans, the majority of the genome is European and African. That's not a small caveat. It's real. So the question that mattered was still open. Were these lines actually from the island's own people, the Taíno themselves? Or had they arrived later, from somewhere else in the Americas, and simply settled in? To answer that, somebody was going to have to get DNA out of the ancient dead. And in the Caribbean, that had always been considered close to impossible. If you're finding this as absorbing as I do, subscribing genuinely helps. This channel exists because enough people want the version of history that got checked rather than the version that got repeated. Now let me tell you what came out of the ground. Heat and humidity destroy DNA. Caribbean soil is close to the worst environment on Earth for preserving genetic material, which is why for decades the ancient Caribbean stayed dark to genetics while Europe lit up. The first crack came from a tooth. It belonged to a woman buried in a cave on a small island in the Bahamas. She lived at least 500 years before Columbus ever saw the Caribbean. An ordinary life, in an ordinary century, on an island where nothing was about to happen for another 20 generations. They got a complete genome out of her, and then they did the comparison that changed the argument. They held her DNA up against living populations across the Americas, looking for her closest surviving relatives. The answer came back: Puerto Ricans. Of everyone alive on Earth, present-day Puerto Ricans were the closest. Then a second team went further, and for me, this is where the whole story stops being an argument and becomes something else. They went to burial grounds in Puerto Rico itself. 3 pre-contact sites, 124 individuals, bone, teeth, the hardened plaque scraped off ancient molars, people who lived and died on that island before any European knew it existed. Most of the samples were too degraded. That's normal. But from 45 of them, they pulled complete maternal genomes. And when they compared those ancient lines to the lines living in Puerto Ricans today, 3 of them matched. Not similar, not related in the general way all humans are related. The same lines, still here, still being passed down right now in people going to work in San Juan and Ponce in New York and Orlando, most of whom have no idea they're carrying it. The women in those graves have descendants. The census said they had none. I keep circling back to one image, and I'll admit it's the reason I wanted to make this video at all. Somewhere on that island, there is a woman who was buried 1,000 years ago by people who loved her, in ground that was hers, under a sky she knew the names of. And every institution that came afterward, every empire, every church registry, every school textbook, every census taker, agreed that her line had ended. It hadn't. It was in the room the whole time. Her descendants were the ones being taught she was extinct. There's one more finding, and it's the one I'd tell a friend at dinner. The largest study of ancient DNA ever done in the Americas looked at the pre-contact Caribbean as a whole, and it found something nobody expected. 19 pairs of genetic cousins, people carrying the shared DNA of close relatives, buried on different islands. In the most extraordinary case, one man was laid to rest in the Bahamas. His relative was laid to rest about 600 miles away in what is now the Dominican Republic. 600 miles of open water, shifting currents, winds that make some of those crossings genuinely dangerous even now. They weren't isolated islanders. They were one people spread across an archipelago, moving constantly, marrying across the sea, close enough that you find cousins scattered over a distance most Europeans of the same era would never have traveled in a lifetime. Which reframes everything about what was lost. This wasn't a set of small separate tribes that could be picked off one island at a time. It was a network, a world. And what the ships broke wasn't just a population, it was the connective tissue between people who had been visiting each other for centuries. Now here's where I have to be honest with you, because this is where the story stops being clean. The same study that found those cousins also found something that complicates the tragedy. Using a new method for estimating past population size, the researchers concluded that Hispaniola and Puerto Rico together probably held somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of people before Europeans arrived, not the million Columbus reported to his patrons, and not the millions later claimed. That number caused real discomfort, and I understand why. But the researchers themselves were blunt about it. A smaller population does not make what happened smaller. It was still a deliberate, systematic dismantling of a world. If anything, it means that world was more fragile than anyone realized, and that erasing it took less than we thought. And there's a harder question underneath all of this, one that DNA cannot answer, no matter how good the sequencing gets. Does an unbroken maternal line make you Taíno? Some historians say no, that ancestry is not the same as peoplehood, that a culture is language and ceremony and continuous community, and that those things were genuinely severed. That carrying a lineage is not the same as carrying a nation. Others say the severing itself was the crime, and that people who were forcibly written out of their own identity don't need permission from the institution that did the writing. Nobody has resolved this. I'm not going to pretend I can. What I'll say is that the argument is happening among people who have skin in it, Taíno community leaders, Puerto Rican geneticists, historians from the island, and it deserves to be theirs to have. But something has shifted, and you can watch it happen in the numbers. In the census at the turn of the millennium, about 13,000 people in Puerto Rico marked themselves as Native American. 20 years later, that figure had passed 80,000. The island's population didn't grow, it shrank. What changed is what people were willing to write down about themselves, which, when you think about it, is precisely the mechanism that erased them in the first place, finally running in the opposite direction. And up in the mountains at Caguana, on stone courts laid out around 700 years ago beneath the mountain where the gods were said to live, people gather for ceremonies, not as reenactment, as continuation. Here's the thing I'd leave you with. You have used their language today, almost certainly. If you have said hurricane or hammock or barbecue or canoe or tobacco, you were speaking Taíno. Those words survived because Europeans encountered things they had no words for and had to borrow. The people were erased from the records by the same civilization that could not describe a storm without their help. And on that island, millions of people call themselves Boricua. It's the warmest word they have for each other, the one that means ours, the one on the flags at parades and in the songs. It comes from Borican, the island's own name for itself. It never left. It was in everybody's mouth the entire time. So go back to that page in the archive. The census, the columns, the careful ink, the zero. I used to think a document like that was a record of something that had happened. It isn't. It's a record of what somebody decided. The zero wasn't a measurement. It was an instruction, to everyone who would ever read it, about who was permitted to exist. And the people it was written about are still here, reading it.